My name is Colleen Baker. I am a producer here at the Houston Chronicle. And first and foremost, I want to make sure that everyone can hear us and that everyone can see us okay. I see plenty of people logging on. And I want to first and foremost ask everyone where they're tuning in from. Are you in Bel Air, like Caroline over there? Obviously, one of our panelists, Caroline Cheong, is from the Kinder Institute, is on. We also have Brian Murray from the city of from Harris County, and we have Travis Herzog, of course, from KTRK. These are very familiar names in the weather and climate and housing space. I already see people tuning into the chat saying they are also in Bel Air. We have First Ward and Kingwood already chiming in. So I want to make sure that we leave lots of room for questions. So I see Sugarland is on. So obviously start asking your questions for Brian, for Travis, for Caroline, and even for our moderator, Justin Ballard, our meteorologist here at the Houston Chronicle. We are here to answer your questions. Obviously, Justin will set the scene for us in a second, but I want to make sure that if you all have questions regarding, the flooding that just took place here in Texas, of course, we had this event planned well before any of us could have probably anticipated the devastation that happened. So first and foremost, again, I want to say, I believe on behalf of everyone, our hearts are with everyone in the Hill Country and in Kerr County and all the areas particularly hit. So I see obviously that we have people chiming in, and I want to make sure we get to our experts and questions. So I'll go over to you, Justin Ballard, our meteorologist. Justin, can you hear me?
Hopefully everyone can hear me out there. This is going to be an exciting hour, so buckle up. We've got quite a few topics to kind of get through here. So, Colleen, that was a great introduction. Thank you for organizing this and setting this up. We're talking about hurricane season, but Colleen and I were talking offline, earlier this week. We really can't address this topic without also mentioning the flooding that's been going on in the Hill Country, the recent devastation. So we're going to kind of start there, when we're talking about what happened, right? And we're going to go into kind of the weather trends for the upcoming hurricane season. So we know that at least early outlooks, including the NOAA outlook that was issued in May, kind of hinting at an above normal season. We've already seen 3 named storms. Thankfully, none have, fingers crossed, impacted us here in Texas, or at least not directly. We're also going to talk, of course, about emergency management. How has the city of Houston, how has Harris County kind of evolved the preparedness landscape? And I'm sure Brian is going to agree with this when I say this. Harris County is prone to not just hurricanes, not just tropical storms, all forms of natural disasters. So this is hurricane season preparedness, but I really want everyone tuning in, all 400 of you, to really be kind of thinking about this through a disaster preparedness mindset, not just a hurricane season mindset. And we're also going to talk about how kind of climate vulnerability affects, all of us here in Houston and Harris County. So first of all, we're going to get started, by kind of just opening up here the discussion with, hurricane season is here. We're in the midst of it. It's July 10th. We've got roughly 4 to 6 weeks before the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season begins. How is everyone kind of prepared for the season, or how should people be preparing for the season? We'll start with you, Travis.
Hey, thank you, Justin, and thanks to all of you who are tuning in. Really excited to be a part of this today, because it was a year ago yesterday, 2 days ago rather, that Hurricane Beryl made landfall here in Southeast Texas. So we know that hurricanes can hit pretty early in the season here. They can hit in August, they can hit in September, even into October, and then the Texas hurricane season usually shuts down after that. But the key at this time is to always be aware of what is going on, and information is crucial this time of year. So this is the time to be staying aware. There's nothing going on right now, but that doesn't mean it may change a week or 2 from now. So we always want to have at least a low-level awareness of what's going on out there in the tropics. And the other thing is to be in a constant state of preparedness as best as you have the means to do so. Even just slowly stockpiling up some extra bottles of water, some extra cans of food, a few extra batteries on the side, and be kind of having that mindset of, if a storm were to form next week and then hit us a few days later, would I be prepared now? Would I have enough food and water to get my family through that storm? And then if necessary, if I live in an evacuation zone, do I have the means to be able to evacuate? And there are some publicly available resources as well that can help those who are elderly, disabled, to get those evacuations, to get help in those times of evacuation. So right now in the calm, that's the best time to be preparing for what's to come and not waiting until the last minute. So I always encourage preparation, have a plan, know what you're going to do if a storm comes, what you need to do to protect your property, but most importantly, the people that are under your care, and then always have that low level sense of awareness of what's going on at a minimum as we journey deeper into hurricane season. Because as Justin will tell you, this is the quiet part of the year. Usually, Beryl was an exception. It's rare we get a hurricane in July. Usually the Texas hurricane season takes off in August and September, if there's going to be any hurricanes that come here at all.
Fingers crossed there's none, at least for this year. So,
Right.
Brian, kind of related to this topic of preparedness, how has the emergency preparedness messaging evolved, both for local community folks, for residents that live in Harris County, and also for the city of Houston? I know obviously preparedness is something that's continuing to change from one year to the next. So how has Harris County and how have residents of Harris County had to adapt to those changes?
Yeah, Justin, and number one, I'm about to hire Travis. He got out my preparedness message as well as anybody else could. So thank you very much for that. For all of those you tuned in today, thank you very much. It's great to be able to be a part of this. Justin, to your question, I think what we're seeing, especially here, if you look at the last few disasters we've had in Harris County, most of them haven't been tropical in nature. The derecho last year happened well before hurricane season began. The winter storms we've had, the winter weather we've had, nothing to do with hurricane season. I think what we really know in Harris County from our experience is that preparedness is a year-round thing. And to say that you need to get prepared for hurricane season is not incorrect, but it only tells half the story. To say that we only need to be prepared for 6 months out of the year doesn't cover our risks and threats here. We have so many risks and threats that being prepared every day is the only way to go. So, and I go back to something Travis said that's very true. Slowly building your disaster preparedness kit, canned food, water, and those things over time, and you just sustain that kit. You use it when you need to, you refill it when you've used things. That's the way to go. Making sure that your plans at home are solid. I think there's been a lot of talk about messaging over the last few days. It's great and one thing for us to give messages and warnings and alerts. It's another thing for residents to understand that when they get those alerts, they have to be prepared and they have to have planned to react to them. Those messages usually contain some sort of actionable protective action information. You have to be prepared to do that. So I think really what's evolved here is it's not a top-down thing to be prepared. It's a joint effort between the government, the community, the residents to be prepared and be ready to respond to any threats.
A little common sense tip that I didn't realize this until last year, and I know Brian, you and I have talked about this. If you're buying things for your emergency kit, particularly food, canned food, non-perishable food, make sure it's something that you're going to eat because a can of queso black bean chicken sounds good on the shelf, and then you get home and it's disgusting. So I've learned that mistake once, never again. So make sure it's things that you're actually going to want to eat, right? So, okay. So this is very helpful, right? How has the city of Houston specifically, how are they kind of prepared for the emergency, for the hurricane season to come? I know a viewer asked this question, but this is really just kind of steering this topic along of preparedness, not just at the community, the resident level, but also at the city and local level.
Justin, was that for me as well?
Sorry, yeah, that question's for you.
Well, I hesitate to speak for the city of Houston since we are different in Harris County, but I will say that in terms of the messaging, in terms of a lot of the planning we do, there's not a whole lot of daylight between us. I think we recognize we serve the same community, and one of the important things is, for the most part, if you hear a message that's specifically for the city of Houston, that's part of Harris County as well. And we coordinate with the city of Houston, their Office of Emergency Management, very closely, certainly in a lot of the planning things, but also even in alerts and warnings. When they get escalated to the point where there's immediate threats and dangers, we are talking behind the scenes to make sure that we're sending out the same message and we're being consistent.
And I want to bring you into this conversation about preparedness because, we can talk about being prepared, and how to be prepared kind of on an economical sort of sense. But there's also huge vulnerabilities in communities across Houston. And obviously, Houston's not special with this regard. But, when we're talking about a local community, there's areas that are more vulnerable than others, and you kind of deal with that kind of climate equity, housing equity. How do we kind of get the messaging out to some of our most vulnerable communities who are also dealing with, the usually the brunt of some of these events, disasters?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll just echo Travis and Brian and say thank you for having the Kinder Institute and myself here today to talk about this incredibly important issue, especially now, right as we're in the thick of it. And I think that you said that really well, that, there are preparedness across the board, as Travis and Brian have both said, is incredibly important, and especially now in the quiet season. But for some communities, they do need to be mindful of kind of where they live and what their particular vulnerabilities are. And that in some communities, they need to be kind of extra prepared. They need to take that extra step because some of the research that we found in our most recent state of housing report showed, that more than 20% of all housing units in Harris County are in one of the three major flood areas, right? Floodways, 100-year floodplain or 500-year floodplain. But then on top of that, there's certain communities that, again, have this extra layer of what we call vulnerability. We had some areas where, nearly 70% of homes lacked central air conditioning, and in other areas, 1 in 20 households lack complete plumbing. So if you know that you're in one of these particularly vulnerable areas, then it's incumbent upon you to kind of take those extra steps to figure out, okay, what resources do I need to prepare myself, my family, my neighbors in the event of a climate shock. And the way that we talk about these climate issues is really in two ways. There's these sort of slow, everyday, sort of creeping experiences of climate change, right? Having to walk across a really, really hot parking lot in the middle of July or August without, minimal tree coverage, or, being at a bus stop without shelter, right? And these kinds of daily experiences that you also need to be prepared for because they have long-term implications for your public health, for your daily commute, and your economic well-being and survivability. But then there's these climate shocks that we're talking about, the hurricanes, the floods, a derecho or Beryl. And so it's preparedness in two ways. And we really need to, I think, be mindful of the level and the degree of preparedness that we all need to have, but understanding that we all have that sort of base level of preparedness.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Caroline. So obviously, I want to kind of talk a little bit about what's gone on in Hill Country lately. We have all watched this kind of unfold over the last week or so, and our hearts are certainly still with and will continue to be with Central Texas Hill Country as they continue to recover. But there's also been a lot of really bad information that's been getting out in terms of, how all of this kind of came about. So Travis, I know you expertly wrote just a couple of days ago on your Facebook page, some of the conspiracies you confronted him head on. So can you talk a little bit about first what kind of led into this event, because it was multifaceted, from a weather standpoint, but then talk also a little bit about the conspiracy theory that these events are being somehow manipulated by cloud seeding or something of that nature.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. And when I mentioned earlier that you need to stay at least at a base level, casually aware of what's going on during hurricane season, I should have also paired that with it's important that you find a trusted voice that has a proven track record that you can go to get that information from, whether that's Justin, whether that's us here at ABC 13. I really don't care who it is. I just want to make sure that you find a legitimate meteorologist to help guide you through these weather events that you trust, because there is a lot of bad information out there, and a lot of it will find you in the wild, even if you're not looking for it, and cause you to question things. So with regards to the tragic flooding that we had last week, this was the result of a tropical weather system that no longer had a name. So it doesn't need to have a name to be a dangerous, destructive, highly disruptive weather event here in Southeast Texas or anywhere in our state. And the basic kind of Cliff's Notes version of what happened is we had a tropical storm named Barry that was named and made landfall in Mexico in about 24 hours. It then lost its identity as a tropical depression, tropical storm, but the remnant moisture moved over central Texas and just sat there because it was trapped in between two steering high pressure systems, very similar to the way that Harvey came in and got trapped by two heat domes on either side of Texas that caused the air to stagnate. We then also had moisture from Hurricane Flossie in the Pacific that got peeled off by the upper level winds sent over Mexico into Texas. That added to the pile of moisture, which sent it to the 99th percentile or greater for this time of year. And usually this is the time of year when we're going to see our greatest amounts of tropical moisture, July, August, September. And so that's an extreme amount of moisture that was just sitting there waiting to be wrung out by a weather system. And in this particular case, we had a weak area of circulation that spun up in the mid levels of the atmosphere, so not low down, but mid levels up, several miles above the atmosphere, and it organized all that rain into a system known as a mesoscale convective vortex, which is basically a fancy way of saying a low pressure center that's spinning in the mid levels of the atmosphere. And what was incredibly destructive about the storms is the fact that there was a channel of moisture of strong winds coming off the Gulf that was feeding straight into it. And so there's a little bit of what we call orographic lift, where when air hits a hill or a mountain, it begins to rise. But those strong winds, if they're strong enough, they will prop those storms up and prevent them from moving. What usually happens is when it rains, that dense rain-cooled air, in the absence of strong winds pushing against it, will start spreading out. And so that's what we saw the past couple of days here in the Houston area. You saw these storms, they were heavy, but they kept moving. That air kept spreading out. Well, in this case, as it rained, those strong winds from the Gulf were just forcing that air to stay put. And so the cold air was not moving away, and the heavy rain just kept on going down. And we're used to getting rainfall amounts of 10, 12 inches. And when it happens, it's a disaster for us, but it's a different kind of disaster because we're a coastal plain. So when we get 10, 12 inches of water and trillions of gallons falling down on Houston and Harris County, we're so flat that yes, it floods some homes, it floods some businesses, but it's more of a gradual rise compared to what happens in the hill country. So very rarely do we encounter a situation where we have water coming into homes that's killing people. We did have some of that during Harvey. Prior to that, doesn't really happen. We don't have much record of it because we're so flat. There's a lot of space for that water to spread out. In the hills and valleys of the hill country, when that heavy rain hits and it falls on the limestone out there, which is like nature's concrete, it runs down with rapid speed in through the creek and the river valleys and in incomprehensible and shocking ways. That's just the history of Flash Flood Alley, as we call it, in the Texas hill country. I grew up on the outskirts of the hill country. I was raised fishing the Blanco River. There have been some epic floods since Kyle, Texas was built along the Blanco River, and Wimberley, going back to the 1800s. So this really is nothing new in terms of the threat that this kind of weather system can pose. Thankfully, they are infrequent. But if you look at the three highest water levels along the Guadalupe where we had these floods, they all occurred in the month of July. So there's something about this time of year where those ingredients can come together with the remnants of tropical systems and all that moisture, and it just sits there and it causes that. So that's what caused the flood. The warnings were sent out by the National Weather Service. We don't know how those warnings were received. We're still piecing that together. But what we can say definitively is that you may have seen some videos claiming that there's a cloud seeding company called Rainmaker that was doing projects near San Antonio 2 days before the flood, and that they're responsible. That is scientifically unsound and just junk, to be honest with you. There is no way that cloud seeding could have caused a storm of that magnitude. Cloud seeding takes an existing storm and enhances the rainfall by 5, 10, 15%. Some say maybe up to 20%, but it's a lone cloud. It's not a gigantic thunderstorm complex covering sizes that are greater than states in our country, okay? There's not enough. We cannot simply do that with the technology that we have today. So it's a tragedy what happened there, and we hopefully are going to learn from it. We owe it to the survivors of the storm and for those who lost their loved ones to make sure that we have an alert system in place to where we can have a better chance that the people that would be in harm's way could survive the next time one of these floods hit. Because if there's anything we know, it's that there will be another one. And in the climate that we are in now, with warmer oceans, warmer air, these types of heavy rainfall events, while still infrequent, will become more likely as a result of our warming oceans and our warming atmosphere. And so that'll take what might have been just a moderate flood to a major flood. And so the likelihood of those will be increasing over time.
You hit the nail on the head. When you're talking about getting good information, reliable information, there's a number of places you can get it. But Harris County also has a text service, correct? So Brian, talk to me a little bit about that and how that kind of relates to preparedness, because we can talk about how this is going to happen in X, Y number of days, but it really is ultimately up to everyone watching this here to stay informed.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Justin. And that's something that I've really been thinking about over the last several days. So our strategy at Harris County is very simple. We communicate consistent information via multiple channels. What I can't do is I can't force you to get the message. I can't force you to act on the message. We offer through if you go to readyharris.org, you can see where you can sign up for Ready Harris alerts. For most things, we will communicate via email and text. We have the capability to call you if the system, if the situation calls for it. We will communicate via wireless emergency alerts, those alerts you get on your phone. I'm going to tell you right now, one of the things that we do know is that Texas has the highest percentage of Americans who have turned off the ability to receive emergency alerts on their phones. And we can have a conversation forever as to why. I don't really care why. I just need you to turn them back on. It is absolutely the most important communications tool we have because it reaches everybody. Even if you're here from out of town, if you've got a cell phone, you're getting that message. So, those are the big ones. We communicate via social media. We communicate using traditional media. We have a text number set up. You can text Gulf 2025 to 888-777. We will send you information throughout hurricane season. As Travis says, it's a good way of keeping a casual eye on things that are going on, maybe not immediate to us, but could be an impact in the next several days. But again, I'm going to say this 1,000 times, and I apologize for repeating myself. You have to be set up not only to receive the message, you have to be monitoring for the information, and then you have to be prepared to take the actions.
Right, thank you, Brian. So, Caroline, I want to ask you this, and I'm sticking to this outline as best I can, but I'm also jumping around because that's just how my brain works. But Caroline, when we're talking about emergency preparedness, there's obviously, there's communities that we're not reaching, in media, in broadcast, in emergency management, kind of in the emergency management realm. How can we get the messaging of preparedness out to some of these vulnerable communities? Are there certain, methods or tactics that may be more efficient than what we've had or been doing so far?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great question. I think, not to get too far into the weeds of this, in some communities, there's a certain distrust of sort of public media, social media, government, what have you. And, in those communities, they really rely on the local community themselves as a form of messaging, right? So in those kinds of communities, in those specific communities, it's really incumbent upon the local community groups themselves, the local community organizations, which usually serve as community centers, as focal points for community gatherings, and also in terms of emergency management, as again those management centers of providing services and resources in times of emergencies. And so, in terms of getting the message out in those times, if like Brian was saying, that a number of people don't have their emergency messaging set on, which by the way, I honestly don't know how to turn it off. So, I think in some ways, kudos to those people who have figured it out. I don't know, or not, but it's again, really incumbent upon, I think, those local community groups to recognize that they are the sort of focal point and the center point of getting the information out, right? So whether that's informal messaging of, okay, we know we have something coming towards us, and we need to go door to door to specific houses that they have relationships with, to knock on those doors and say, it's time, you got to have this X, Y, and Z prepared. Or if it's, a more informal chain, whether it's a text thread or another community group. But in those specific communities, Justin, to your question, it's really important to rely on community leaders, community groups, and really localized points of information and dissemination for those particular communities. And it's kind of incumbent upon government too, and whether it's council members or other, again, as sort of hyper local as you can get, to recognize which communities those are that might be harder to reach, and to have them on speed dial and say, okay, council member, I know that I need to, send out a blast text to these 4 community group leaders, or, get on the phone and say, community leader Joe, you need to send out your message, right? So again, it's kind of dialing back that community messaging that we have, but in those communities, that's generally, I think, the most efficient way to reach those populations.
Great point, Caroline. No sooner than you started answering that question, Brooke dropped in the chat, partner with those nonprofits to get the word out to those vulnerable communities. That is absolutely essential. So thank you both, Brooke and Caroline, for kind of mentioning that and bringing that to our attention. Obviously, it's important this time of year, especially. Now, power outages are a thing that we contend with here in Southeast Texas on even a good day. So we saw this with Beryl. More than 2 million people were without power. I was without power for 8 days. So, I mean, just to give you an idea, a lot of us are reliant on that, having ability to have power. So when we're talking about these text messages, network outages, for instance, is there a guarantee that those messages, those alerts, are going to get to your phone? I'll ask Travis, but I really want any and all of us here in this panel to kind of weigh in on that. So this includes you, Brian, and Caroline as well. But Travis, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll start with this, and then I'm curious to hear Brian's comments after I kind of lay this out about this, maybe rethinking some of the strategies, because as many have commented in the chat, that sometimes the cell service goes down and you don't have you can't get the TV signal. So how can I get a signal? And one of the ways that was pushed a lot in previous decades was through a NOAA weather radio, having the ability to have a radio that can receive a signal when the power is down because it's battery operated, and it will flash an alarm in the middle of the night and wake you up if there is a serious alert. The eye-opening part about this is that I was in discussion with a couple of meteorologists. One of them I knew from back in college. He was in my wedding, and they serve as neighborhood liaisons over in Fort Bend County for kind of general safety of the community. And they were talking about the benefits of having a NOAA weather radio in light of what happened in the Texas Hill Country, where we don't know if cell service was good enough to get those alerts to people that needed it. And what they realized is that almost everyone in their neighborhood had no idea what a NOAA weather radio was. They didn't even know it existed, because we have grown so accustomed to everything living on here that we think, I got everything I need. There's no reason to have another service, but we need to have these multiple redundancies and multiple ways of receiving that kind of message. And so that's the thing. And we've actually partnered with Houston Public Media, News 88.7, so that if for some reason our signal goes down, perhaps we can still get it out on the radio. And so that's a partnership that we have created so that we are able to do that going forward in the future. And something I've been preaching here at the station for a while is that, because we actually lost power during Beryl. There was a failure in our transfer switch that went from the grid to our backup generator. We were down for 45 minutes as the hurricane's eye wall was coming into Houston. And so we need to, have multiple ways to get our signal out on our end, and you need to have multiple ways on your end to also receive it.
Which is the absolute worst time for someone going wall to wall to lose power during that eye wall during Beryl. So Brian, I want to pick your brain on that topic as well. There's obviously some flaws or some weaknesses, we'll say, in how we're able to access information, especially if communications are down, if the network is down, and we saw that with Beryl. So what can we do?
Yeah, and I'm going to go right back over Travis, because we also have a partnership with 88.7 for exactly the same reason. One of the things we noticed after the derecho last year, and then also after Beryl, is we kind of had a dead zone out in the northwest part of the county. Cell towers, they were working on generator power for a while, and I don't know if fuel ran out or what happened, but cell towers did go down. We had areas that did not have cell service, and we had talked about it for a long time, but we now have we've had a relationship with KUHF for a long time. We've kind of rewarmed that up, and that is that's our plan B. And that AM radio, FM radio is the plan B. Almost everyone has a car. Even if they don't have power to get, to their phone, they can probably sit out in their car for 10 minutes, or they've got the battery powered radio. I also want to go back to what Travis mentioned about the NOAA weather radio. Again, I'm not quite ready to, comb through the information that we're getting from the whole country, but we did get some fairly reliable information that one of the camps was able to, effect a rescue and, save themselves because of the NOAA weather radio. That is part of our plan as well. We will broadcast not only the wireless emergency alerts, but we can do the emergency alert system, which gets it out over the weather radio band, which gets it out over TV and radio. So again, there is unfortunately a point where there's folks that we're not going to reach as well as we'd like to. Even in the situation where we had flooding in the Sanjak River area last year, we had first responders going down the streets, lights and sirens, with their loudspeakers, telling people to go. We can go that far. We will go that far. But again, being ready to receive the message, knowing where to go and get the message, that's something we're constantly working on, something we're always going to be working on. So as we find new opportunities to reach the public, we're going to look and see which ones make sense and, which ones we can easily take advantage of. But we're pretty relentless around here in terms of trying to find a new way to do something. If I have to make copies on the Xerox machine and distribute leaflets, man, that's what we're going to do to get the word out.
Fantastic, Brian. Caroline, I know you come from Florida. I was in Florida before moving here. What are some weaknesses that you think the state of Texas, just in general, has when it comes to hurricane season preparedness?
So yeah, I was in Florida for 6 years, and we've talked a little bit about this, that in the 6 years in Florida, we had numerous hurricanes to the point where it was sort of, the typical Florida man experience where you sit back and you just watch and you kind of just wait. And my experience in Beryl was completely different here, where, as you lost power for 8 days, I lost power for 9 days, which has never happened in all of my years in Florida. So that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. And I think, I think this horse has been thoroughly beaten, to use that awful analogy, but our infrastructure grid here in Texas needs to be addressed. And I know that Centerpoint is making headway on that. But, the fact that, we live in the fourth largest city in the country and, we have people who are out of power for 9 days is problematic, and especially because those pockets of people who are out of power, again, they tend to be, and vulnerable people tend to live in vulnerable places, right? So the people who have the less means or the less resources to respond to a loss of power, or the impact of that loss of power is going to be profoundly more significant than somebody in another neighborhood. That's problematic. And that's something that I think, we need to address. And it's multifaceted, right? It's clearing the power lines, the clearing trees, but then getting those power lines back up and running, ensuring that in the medium term that, we have access to generators or alternative sources of power. So it's everything that we're talking about. The preparedness in general, that I think, obviously needs to be, leveled up a bit, just because the foundational baseline of our power grid being more vulnerable than in other places that are more prone to hurricanes, needs to be addressed in a very substantial way. And, I recognize that Florida and Texas have different experiences with hurricanes and different, geographies in terms of what we have here and histories. But it's something that I think has been, noticed and observed for long enough that there need to be substantial changes implemented from the top level all the way down to, the household level.
We're obviously still talking about hurricane season. I don't want to let this moment go without talking about the forecast, right? So, it's been fairly quiet so far. And now that I've said that, of course, I'm going to find wood to knock on. But talk to me a little bit, Travis, about the forecast going forward for kind of the rest of the hurricane season. We know, or at least you and I know, that we're heading into the peak in about mid-August, lasting through mid-September, mid-October before things start to quieten down here. But talk to me about those critical few weeks between now and then.
So my mother is a nurse, first off, and any nurse will tell you never say the Q word. It's too quiet, okay? So it actually was a pretty sleepy start to our hurricane season. We've gotten accustomed to almost these preseason developments that happen in May or even in April, or these rip-roaring fast starts. I mean, we had Beryl already make landfall by the time we were at this point in the hurricane season last year. And looking back at the numbers, we're now have just saw the sea name pass by. That was Chantal, which quickly formed off the Carolina coast and caused some extreme flooding in the Carolinas. And so now we're actually a few weeks ahead of schedule when it comes to the historic average. When you average up the seasons from 1991 to 2020, historically, you get your third named storm of the season around August the 3rd, and your first hurricane on average typically happens around August 11th. So on the hurricane part, we're still kind of on track. You know, we haven't seen a hurricane yet, and that usually does not happen until August 11th. A typical season, you're going to get 14 named storms, 7 of those become hurricanes, and about 3 become major. And the brunt of those hurricanes are in August, September, October. That's when the conditions just come together across the Atlantic. Historically, you have the warmest water of this year, you have the lowest wind shear of the year, you have pockets of moisture that come across from the African continent that we call tropical waves that serve as the seeds for those storms. Those ingredients usually don't come together until August and September. And when you look at the Texas hurricane season in particular, we can get early activity in June and July, usually more tropical storms than hurricanes. Then you see an uptick in August and a crescendo in September. And by the time we get to the end of September, it's like we hit a wall and the activity just falls off. Latest storm on record that was a hurricane to make landfall in Texas was Hurricane Jerry that hit here in the Houston-Galveston region back in October 15th of 1989. It actually formed on the tail end of a cold front just a few days before it made landfall. We were in the 40s, and usually we say, hey, we've got the cold fronts, we're done. Not always the case, but we like seeing the cold fronts because the jet stream winds that push those cold fronts down to the Gulf are the same winds that steer the hurricanes away from us. You may recall last year, Hurricane Milton, an October hurricane, it went from left to right across the Gulf, and people were saying, I've never seen this before. Well, that's what hurricanes do that late in the season. That's one of the protective benefits of living in Texas once we get into the fall. As far as the rest of the season is concerned, the most of the groups that are responsible for putting out forecasts, they're putting out how many named storms are we going to have and how much what we call accumulated cyclone energy will they produce, which is a better measure of how active a hurricane season is. Most of them are saying it's probably going to be what we'd consider a near normal season. But the reality is those outlooks are meaningless for us because all that matters is where the storms form and where they go. And the typical example of that we like to point out is 1983. The first storm of the season was a little hurricane named Alicia that formed in August. It formed from a storm system that came out of the lower Mississippi River Valley. So it wasn't a traditional, we're watching this coming across the Atlantic. This came from the north, and then it formed offshore and swung right into Galveston as a Category 3. That all happened within 3 days. There were only 4 storms that formed that season. Would you say it was a bad season or an active season for us? Absolutely. So that's why, regardless of the outlooks, we have to stay prepared. Now, there are certain groups that are working on, can we identify which stretches of coastline are more at risk in the season ahead? And there is some progress being made on that, but I don't think it's to a level yet where we can make reliable predictions. But we do know that one of the biggest influences on where storms go depends on El Nino versus La Nina versus La Nada. And I like to point out this fact that every El Nino we've had going back to 1950, there hasn't been a single hurricane that's hit Texas. So there's something about El Nino years with the way they steer storms and the wind shear patterns they produce that tend to bring our numbers down. Where we get the most hurricane activity, which is where we spend about 50% of all hurricane seasons over time, is in what we call La Nada, which is neither El Nino, neither La Nina. And last year we were in La Nada and we got Beryl. We're still in La Nada right now. So the door is certainly open to Texas. No one can tell you whether or not a storm is going to come. And I've also looked back, Justin, at, what are the odds we get hit in back-to-back seasons? Has that happened before? Well, you have to go all the way back to the 1940s to find us getting hit by back-to-back hurricanes in consecutive seasons. It actually happened in 3 seasons in a row. One of those, we had 2 hurricanes in the same season. And in that decade, Texas got hit by, I believe, 8 or 9 hurricanes in the 1940s. So there are certainly times where we can get hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, year after year after year. It's rare, but that's kind of thing can happen. So just because we got hit by Beryl last year doesn't mean that we're off the hook for this year.
Telling my friends that may have a little post-Beryl anxiety, over 1 year later, it's rare, Not saying it can't happen, but stay aware just in case. That was an excellent discussion. I'm going to send this back over to Colleen. Obviously, we've got plenty of time to answer some questions. So, Colleen, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We definitely have had, in particular, a lot of questions on alerts. Obviously, with everything going on in the Hill Country, that's probably one of the most pressing things on people's minds. And we went into a lot of it here. I will also say the Houston Chronicle teams, specifically the investigation team, is looking at the statewide alert system. I've heard our teams talking about, if it had deployed, when it deployed, looking at the micro details of, how effective was it, things that are obviously on everyone's minds. So continue to stay tuned for our coverage on that. Definitely, like you all said, and everyone is pointing out in the chat, there are some weaknesses maybe in the system that can be looked at deeper, and our reporting will continue to cover that. So aside from alerts, quite a few questions actually came in, of course, regarding preparedness. And I want to start with Caroline first. This is a question that was really struck me about vulnerable communities. Specifically, someone was asking about any special resources for maybe people specifically with immunocompromised children or people that might need assistance of a feeding tube. I know, it's very crucial of a population that needs those resources. Can you speak to maybe what people in those situations can do? Maybe there's an extra level step of preparedness they can take, or what resources locally might be able to help in this situation?
Yeah, we definitely can. And I actually saw in the chat that somebody else said, how can I recognize when I am in a vulnerable community? And, just to recognize the way different people have defined vulnerability in different ways, right? And in our report, if you go onto our state of housing report, we have a dashboard that lays out the different communities that we have identified as vulnerable communities. And there's certain metrics and there's a methodology behind it, but you can certainly use that as a starting point to identify where your community sits on that vulnerability scale and kind of get ahead of the game a little bit and recognize, okay, if I'm at a certain level of vulnerability, then that means I need to take, a few extra steps to prepare given my certain situation. So for, Colleen, your question, if you are in a medically sensitive or a medically vulnerable situation, I'm imagining you already have a sense of the kinds of supplies that you would need to get ahead of any kind of power outage situation or a shortage of water, and just bulking up on those extra supplies, right? If you know that you're going to need extra filtered water, purified water, or if you know that that having a loss of power is going to lead to a loss of electricity and power to a specific medical device that you need for you or your loved one, ensuring that you have access via a generator, capitalizing on whatever kinds of local, regional, or national resources that you have to purchase a generator, to rent a generator, to even, what we did here is, running lines from your neighbors down the street to get access to power is what you need to do, and really just kind of create that network of communication beforehand. Hey, I may need to run a line in case we lose power from your generator to mine, and just establishing that beforehand. But then also knowing, if things really, really get bad and you don't have access to anything, or you're, day 5 and you're running low on certain supplies, figuring out a way that you can get to good quality medical care. Because usually in times of emergencies, and, Brian can speak to this, the hospitals are, they have generators. They're usually the first up and running in times of an emergency. So if you're running out of supplies, power, getting access and ensuring that you have a pathway to the medical services that you need is crucial.
Absolutely. Brian, is there anything else that maybe, those populations could or should be considering in terms of resources, maybe different than, the regular average person that just needs to be prepared?
No, I think Caroline gave you a lot of really good information on that. The one thing I will add is, dialing 211 and registering for the state of Texas Emergency Assistance Registry is a good idea as well. If you know that during or following a disaster, you may need some special assistance, registering for that is a great idea. One of the things we've been doing for the last 2 years, because the legislation on how this works has changed, there are welfare checks that now occur. If you have signed up in that system, we do welfare checks on every single person registered. So, last year really was the first time this really came into play with the derecho and barrel that we had to do them. But I mean, we managed to reach every single person. We managed to make sure that people were able to get things like oxygen. We were able to make sure that, some people who just needed something simple like a case of water or transport somewhere, we were able to help make those things happen. So I think, again, simple phone call, dial 211, give them your information, and they will, you'll be on the list. We've also, with that particular list of folks, we've also started pre-communicating with them before disaster to make sure they know, hey, if you've got an emergency plan, this is a good time to make sure that all of that is still in place for you. So that population, they've told us they may need additional assistance. We're going to help give them an additional and maybe special warning as well.
Absolutely. Actually, can you repeat that? 211 was the number. Someone else is actually asking it also. If you could repeat it one more time, I want to make sure people can sign up for the welfare checks.
Absolutely. 211. It's the State of Texas Emergency Assistance Registry. It is actually managed by the United Way. They're the ones that do all the information intake. It goes to the State of Texas database. They share with us for Harris County all of the names, all of the signups. And we refresh that list prior to the big incidents. So just because, you signed up in January, we don't forget about you after that. The one caution I do want to throw in, and this is very important, that list is on your existence on that list is only good to December 31st of the year you do it. They do not assume that people have moved or still alive or whatever. So you do have to re-register every year, but it is a very simple step, very easy to do. And when you call 211, I think they can help you in just about any language you need. They're very, it's a very accessible system.
Absolutely. And actually, this goes into another question at large regarding the alerts. Someone was actually saying that Texans have alert fatigue, right? That's a very stark contradiction, or a space that we live in where we do get a lot of alerts, but also need to be safe. So is there a way to alert more geographically? I guess someone was asking, Houston spans hundreds and hundreds of miles. I guess, Brian, is there a little bit more detail you could give us in terms of geographic proximity or how the alerts are distinguished geographically?
So I'm going to wade into some shark infested waters here so you guys can enjoy this for, I think what a lot of people are reacting to is, I know we got them yesterday, the amber alerts, the blue alerts that are sent statewide for something that's happening, 300, 400, 500 miles away. On the local level, it's generally more geo-targeted. Even the National Weather Service, when they do their tornado warnings, which is telling you, hey, there's a tornado in your driveway, those are fairly geo-targeted. The geo-targeting is not perfect. So there's going to be people who aren't affected that are going to get them. That technology is getting better, but it is a technology issue, not a practitioner issue. I would say this, and this is one of the challenging things that people need to understand about alerts and warnings. For our purposes, especially with the wireless emergency alerts, which I think is what a lot of that alerting fatigue is coming from, the National Weather Service is our source for weather information, period, end of story when it comes to those alerts. If they send out a wireless emergency alert that there's a tornado warning, that's it. We're not going to follow that up generally with any messaging along those lines of our own because it's not really necessary. Where it becomes in the way our plans would work, let's say that we did have, as happened last year on the east and west fork of the San Jacinto River, there were flood emergencies that were broadcast by the National Weather Service. We followed those up with broadcasted messages of our own, geo-targeted, because we declared a mandatory evacuation in part of that area. So what we're trying to do is make sure that A, we're following up with actionable information where that's necessary, and B, that we limit that to the population that's affected as best we can. I know it's challenging. I know sometimes you're sitting there, you're eating dinner, and then all of a sudden your phone makes it sound like there's 27 banshees running through your living room. But you know what? You're having those, alerts set to go off. That can save your life. And so as much as I understand the argument about alert fatigue, I think what we've got is we've got some folks who are maybe not using the system in the most, I don't want to say appropriate way, but I will say the smartest way. And that's maybe causing some irritation, but the alert system itself is valuable. and it is there to save your lives. And, you know, if you don't know how to do it, you know, we've been putting it on our messaging in terms of how to make sure those alerts are turned on. But, you know, please take advantage of the time now on a relatively blue sky day to make sure you can get messages.
I want to add something to that about the wireless emergency alerts. So those were started in 2012. When they were first launched, they were issued, you know, severe weather alerts would be issued for entire counties, or those alerts would be sent out for entire counties. Now we've gotten it to where really and truly only, we call it the polygon, only the warned area is what's pinged. So specific weather alerts, and those are only going to be issued for the worst case, the most extreme weather, not I call it run-of-the-mill severe weather. We're not talking, you know, winds 60 miles per hour and 1-inch hail. We're talking 75, 80, 90 mile per hour winds and higher, and devastating flash flooding. Those are only going to be issued when, you know, those sorts of circumstances are being met. And I'm not obviously, you know, advocating or not, but you can turn off the kind of Amber Alerts, the public safety messages, the weather alerts. Those you need to have on without a doubt. But some of the other alerts, again, if you choose to turn those off, you can. You do have that ability to do so in your phone settings. Not that you should, but you can.
Yes, absolutely. And for a lot of people asking about those alerts and the information that you might have missed, the 211, you know, information that is being provided, I want to make sure everyone knows this information, this entire interview and panel discussion will be posted to the Houston Chronicle YouTube channel afterwards. We wrap up within 48 hours. We tend to get it up very quickly, obviously, especially with this being such an important topic. We'll get it up as quickly as we can, but it will have all the information there, and you can send it to everyone you need to if you need to revisit it as well. So on top of that, I actually want to touch on something that's quite common being brought up in the chat, and I kind of want Travis to weigh in on this first, because people are asking about the cuts to the National Weather Service and to NOAA. And this is something obviously you and Justin, you know, deal with daily as meteorologists. And actually, I want to also get Brian's feedback because, you know, the National Weather Service, like Brian said, is, you know, full stop where we are getting our information from. And, you know, cutbacks to that, I would imagine, you know, as we deal with as journalists and probably as the public feels, adds a strain to it. So, Travis, could you maybe set the scene for that? What the cutbacks look like, what's going on in the background, maybe for some of us that are not as in tune with what's going on?
Sure. I'll just start by talking about a brief history of our country that we have seen going back to the 1800s when we first developed weather bureaus and had the ability to gather weather information through telegraph lines across the country. The importance of centralizing that information for the good of the public, for public safety. Weather is nonpartisan. It impacts us all. It is about safety. And so Republicans, Democrats, independents, everyone has always supported safety. And in light of natural disasters, we're a very reactive society. Usually big funding will come at the federal level. And it is the federal government that primarily funds this because it is a public safety type thing. That's why the National Weather Service is the only one with legal authority to issue weather watches, weather warnings across the country. Some TV stations in Oklahoma started experimenting with that, issuing their own warnings when they had their own radar in the 70s, and the government shut that down. So there's a reason why so much is federally funded. It's because that's the way the system is set up. That includes not only the forecasting and warning apparatus we have in the country, but also the research that we have in the country. And the research is proposed right now to be absolutely gutted. And I've talked to people, you know, this is apart from the Weather Service and the cuts in NOAA, people within the research community and those who have worked on the breakthroughs that have allowed us to get to the forecast as good as they are today for hurricanes and timely warnings, advanced warnings on flash floods and tornadoes. They are absolutely in shock over the proposals to shut down these research institutions. They're zeroing them out on the proposed budget. They are also zeroing out the cooperative institutes, which are the universities that work in partnership with the federal government to research and work on these breakthroughs. And so there's a lot of shock right now over what's being proposed. Now, what's proposed from the executive branch doesn't necessarily get enacted by Congress. But typically when there's a big weather event, like Hurricane Sandy was the last one I can think of, after Sandy, there was a lot of money put behind, and it was bipartisan, huge support to let's invest in better computer modeling data, because the European model beat our model. And, there was a lot of energy and time put into that. And the weather enterprise that we have here in America is world-class gold standard right now. And so when you start picking apart huge chunks of it, things are eventually going to fail. With regards to the National Weather Service, there are some parts of the country where they can no longer have the staffing to launch weather balloons, which is still the best way we have of seeing what's happening in the atmosphere above us. And some offices no longer have 24/7 staffing. Now, ahead of big weather events, they will staff up like they did in the case of the Hill Country floods. Despite the 22% understaffing at the Austin, San Antonio office, they had 5 meteorologists working that event. They did their job, but you're asking an increasingly smaller number of people to do the job that many other people would do. And we also had a huge institutional loss with the amount of people that were near retirement that took the buyouts early. We've seen that in our local office where we had all 3 of the managers gone that had decades of experience. I'm proud to say that we just learned this week that they have now named a new replacement for what's called the meteorologist in charge at the top. That's a start. So now we'll have someone that's running the office again from the top down. I applaud that. And it's someone that grew up here in Houston. So we got a Houston native that knows the area, which is great. But the cuts are going to hurt at some point. We don't know when it's going to happen. In this case, it looks like with the Hill Country floods, the cuts did not impact the operations because they still did their job. They know their core mission is issuing life-saving warnings ahead of time. But eventually you're going to reach a breaking point. There's burnout, there's low morale across the federal weather enterprise, and it is going to have an impact going forward if things don't turn around.
Brian, that's a great point. Is that burnout, or is that affecting, at the county level? Like you said, you're getting your information from them and then having to do, I'm assuming, a lot of administration tasks or weight-bearing tasks based on that information. Have you all felt it at the county level or not yet? What do you think?
I think I haven't seen it yet. And I think Travis kind of alluded to what I have seen. They've been really good about making sure that the folks in the Houston Galveston Weather Office have backstop from, different regional offices. So I haven't seen a degradation in service from them. But the thing that Travis alluded to that's been most important, and I'm seeing the same thing with FEMA, a lot of institutional knowledge has walked out the door. And a lot of people in my Rolodex have walked out the door. So the people that I used to call and say, hey, explain this, or hey, give me some more insight on this, or even the friendly, hey, I read your forecast. What's your actual confidence in this? Ha, ha, ha. They're not there. And the relationships that we build, whether it's in the weather community, the emergency management community, take a long time to build. And when you start losing components of that, that's actually the biggest concern, because when you lose that knowledge, it will at some point, it's going to make something difficult at some point. But so far, I will say the Weather Service office here, they've been absolute troopers with what they're going through. And I probably had the same happy dance Travis did when I saw they had a new meteorologist in charge down there.
Excellent. And I'm assuming, Caroline, maybe it doesn't even touch as far as your area, but on the research side, have you seen anything necessarily impacting your work yet, or anything on the academic side or the Kinder Institute's work?
Yeah, well, but I think the larger challenge that both Travis and Brian were pointing out, though, is just that loss of institutional knowledge and those connections, right? The social network, the social capital that takes years to build up. And the challenge is, honestly, in this situation, in this conversation, you could take out the word weather, emergency management, preparedness, and plug in any number of fields, right? That's true anywhere where we are seeing these drastic cuts. And these challenges are pervasive throughout the National Weather System, all the way up to housing and in medical sciences. It's everything. It's sort of a loss of institutional knowledge, but then also kind of questioning what's the long-term impact of that loss going to be, right? Short term, as Brian was saying, maybe we're not seeing immediate short-term impacts of it right now as we're able to kind of patch things together. But 5 years from now, how is this sort of the detraction going to impact where we are, or where we might have been, the opportunity cost that might be lost from that loss of knowledge and that loss of continuing social relationships that we have. So it's something that we're definitely seeing across the board in the housing sector as well. And just, this sort of time right now of insecurity in general, of not knowing, where your money is coming from, where your support is coming from. And but I will say that it's not all doom and gloom, because I think the sort of upside of it is that people are having to think creatively. People are having to think creatively about how they can reforge certain kinds of relationships, create new relationships, and then also, but think creatively about, other kinds of solutions that they might not have had to think about before, to think outside of the box. So in some ways, that's some aspect of positivity, in that, you're seeing other organizations in my sector, at least, kind of, find new avenues of creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship. So that is one positive, I think, coming out of this.
Absolutely. And on that note, an optimistic note, we use the National Weather Service, of course, like Brian said, every day we continue to monitor their coverage. They are doing fantastic work with all of the resources that they do have, and will continue to be, a very great resource for not only, research, education, the office, everything, weather, every day. We, applaud them as well. On that note, I want to reiterate that we are going to be posting this entire video on our YouTube channel for the Houston Chronicle. Like I said, it will take up to 48 hours, but we try to get it up as quickly as possible so that you can continue to share all of these messages. That this institutional knowledge, like we're talking about, is very important. So it's important that we keep that. And thank you again to Caroline, Travis, and Brian as our panelists. This conversation will continue, of course. Our reporting here at the Houston Chronicle, Justin Ballard, his daily forecast, his reporting, as well as our investigation team, will continue to report, alongside everything that's going on in our climate and our state. So thank you all again. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and please stay safe. If, we can say anything, again, the week of this event in the Hill Country, this week's events have been very challenging for all of us, and for everyone, I'm sure, who's a Texan in general. So again, extending our deepest thoughts and wishes to everyone to be safe, and stay tuned for any coverage, and including ways to donate or help. All of that information can be found, through Harris County has things as well. Our coverage will cover it as well, and stay tuned for that. So thank you so much again, everyone. Stay safe.